Hi, my name is Jim and I was retired. In my bucket system, bucket 1 has cash and equivalents for 3 years worth of expenses. And bucket 2 has mostly bonds and some equity income producing assets that I'll need for years 4 through 8. And bucket 3 has all of my long-term assets for long-term needs. Stay tuned to this video and we'll take a closer look at what's in bucket 3. This is the third in the series of videos that I'm doing on my time buckets, the 3 time buckets for my asset allocations. It's also one of the more interesting ones because I'll also talk about the 3 tax buckets, because bucket 3 has taxable, tax-deferred, and tax-free assets, whereas bucket 1 included taxable and tax-deferred assets, mostly taxable, but some tax-deferred. And bucket 2 had mostly tax-deferred and some taxable. Bucket 3 includes all 3 of the tax buckets. Now, I'm using my spreadsheet portfolio by buckets, and I've done prior videos on that, so I'm not going to go into how the spreadsheet works. Please see the entire playlist for this series plus the spreadsheets if you want to learn more. Hey, and this is probably a good time to stop and make sure that you subscribe to the channel and hit that bell notification so you'll get notified when I do a new video. In this series of videos, I'm using my own actual investments and asset allocations for bucket 1, 2, and 3. I'm about to change some of them, as I've talked about in prior videos. There are some optimizations that I'll be making in the first half of this year as I go towards my goal of being a 60-40 asset allocation, 60% equity and 40% bonds.
Here's a closer look at the equity and fixed income in bucket 3. Whereas bucket 2 was about 84% bonds and only about 16% equity, bucket 3 is 77% equity and about 23% bonds. It's actually a lot easier to see and talk about bucket 3 when you think about those 3 different tax buckets. All of the bonds in bucket 3 are in my tax-deferred accounts, including a bond portion of the Vanguard Wellington Fund holdings, which is about 66% equity and 34% bonds. The other big chunk of fixed income in the tax-deferred area in bucket 3 is a non-qualified fixed indexed annuity, which I'll discuss in a moment. As I discussed in my last video, I will be selling off both of my 2 actively managed mutual funds, Wellington and its sister fund, the Wellesley Income Fund in bucket 2. Now, the Wellington here is in an Admiral class, so the expense ratio is only 0.16%, but that's still about 4 times more than I'd like it to be. Plus, Schwab is now restricted. I can either hold or sell the Wellington, but I can't add it in the Admiral class. If I did, I'd have to buy the investor class, and I'd be at that 0.22 expense ratio. The tax buckets in bucket 3 include about 67% of the assets in bucket 3 are in the tax-deferred accounts. 19% of bucket 3 are tax-free Roth accounts, and 15% are taxable assets. Here's another way of looking at that same pie chart, breaking out asset allocations for those 3 different components. So beginning in my taxable accounts, bucket 3 assets include dividend-paying stocks, AT&T, Pfizer, a Pfizer spinoff, Viatris. These are things that I've either inherited or acquired along the way, and I'm holding them for the dividend paying attributes. As you recall from an earlier video, there are benefits of having dividend income when you're in a lower tax bracket. If you can keep your income below a certain threshold, dividend rate and the long-term capital gains rate in your taxable accounts is 0. There are some other things in the taxable account that just don't make any sense, and they include a REIT fund and some equity index funds, which, while they may kick off a little dividend income, mostly they don't make sense to hold in a taxable account. So in the tax-deferred accounts, there are equity index funds in Marie's IRA and my IRA and my 401k, plus that non-qualified annuity.
By the way, on this non-qualified annuity, it is a bank annuity, and don't let them tell you an annuity is not the same as a CD. When you lock into an annuity, it has a lot of rules and regulations. Fortunately, we're past the 8 years of lockup that would have been hit with surrender charges if we cashed this annuity in. So I've let it ride. It's now through that process. We are guaranteed not to lose any money on this annuity, and it is paying a 3% fixed income. But annuities are not the same as other tax-deferred assets like an IRA. When you pull money out of an IRA, it's treated as ordinary income. As we withdraw money from this annuity, it's going to be tax-deferred, but it's tax-deferred on the capital gains above the principal that you put into the annuity. Now, that's whether you make a partial surrender of the annuity or annuitize it into a lifetime payment.
In the tax-free accounts, which include the Roth 401k and 2 Roth IRAs, one for me and one for Marie, we've invested in riskier assets. One of the guidelines about asset location suggests that you put things that are going to have the most opportunity for growth in your tax-free bucket. And so this is a place where I have some small cap index funds, international index funds, and some REITs. This is a perfect place for the REITs. Here's another picture of the bucket, just concentrating on the asset allocations like that pie chart, but in my bucket fashion. It includes those taxable, tax-deferred, and tax-free assets. And I'm going to be concentrating mostly on the tax-deferred and tax-free assets, since anything I do in the taxable assets will have tax implications. So those I'll make strategically as my tax situation allows. So let's look at some alternatives in the tax-deferred assets with Portfolio Visualizer. And again, I'll put a link to this tool in the notes below. So first, I'm going to back test the Bucket 3 tax-deferred assets based on the current portfolio. And I've figured out the weight of each asset within that subset of tax-deferred assets within Bucket 3. And I've entered in the tickers. Now, since there is no ticker for an annuity, I'm using BND as a proxy for it. And I put in the weights here. Likewise, I've added and adjusted the weights for my 401k funds, since they don't have tickers, to an approximate one in my IRA. As you can see, we'll analyze this portfolio. It has a CAGR of about 15.45 with a standard deviation of 12.12. And so those are the numbers that I'm going to pay attention to as I look to optimize the assets. So while I'm here in the back testing a portfolio, I'm going to enter in 2 more portfolios to compare what I could replace with the Wellington. One option is to use funds I already have, and another is to use a mega cap fund, MGC from Vanguard, to replace the equity portion of the Wellington fund. Let me enter those numbers now. And so the original portfolio, something that replaces Wellington with my current assets, and something that replaces it adding one more asset for the mega cap ETF. CAGRs are all pretty close to each other, and so are the standard deviations. Let's see if we can improve it through portfolio optimization instead. So I concentrate on the assets in my IRA. I'm going to lock in some choices for Marie's assets. And it can be no higher than the combined of the two zero funds. Now I'm going to optimize for the maximum return with the same approximate volatility as the other alternatives. Here was the original that we put in, and here is the return for a maximum return of 12%, just over 12% volatility. It changes the formula just a little bit to combine all of Marie's international fund with her total market fund, and it increases what we would put into the VDAD, the Dividend Appreciation Fund, and decreases what I would put into the VTI, which was surprising for me. As you can see, the performance annual CAGR is a little higher. It's close to what the mega cap would have been. And the standard deviation is at that same 12.01 in both cases. So I've kept the same volatility, but improved without adding a new investment with the mega cap fund with my existing funds. That's probably the idea that I'm going to use. Now we're going to go through the same process with the tax-free assets. So again, I'm using the IRA assets for the Roth 401k assets, since there are no tickers for the 401k assets. So I'm combining there a little bit. And again, here are the assets we currently own in our 3 Roth accounts. And we'll analyze this. If a new asset is on the books, it's only going to have a record for a few years. So the Fidelity Zero Total Market Fund has only been around since 2018. So in this case, I'm going to use VTI in both places. Now, it also says that the VXUS has only been around since 2011, and you can use this international stock index as a replacement. Now, it says that the small cap VB has only been around since 2004, and you should use this fund. Now, it says that the Animal Fund has only been around since 2001, so you can use the older investor class. And it says VTI has only been around since 2001. Now we're using ticker symbols that have been around a while. Let's analyze. Now this says that the real estate index has only been around since June 1996. That's long enough for me. As you can see, the CAGR is around 9.14% over that long period of time, with a standard deviation of 16.72. I'd like to see if I can get that down to about 15 for my Roth assets. So we'll do a little portfolio optimization. So with these assets here, we're going to jump over to the portfolio optimization for Roth to see what it suggests. Over in the portfolio optimization, I took those asset allocations and weights from the previous screen and brought them over here. And again, we're going to optimize the goal of maximum return subject to the 15% volatility. Now, one of the things I did here was I added those assets with the weights, but I've added back in the ticker symbols that I'm currently using. Even if you don't put allocations here, this system will use those and find the optimum combination of assets for you. So I'm going to optimize. And again, it'll give you this notice here, but I'm okay. I just want to see what suggestions it has. Well, lo and behold, it suggests put everything in Roth and VTI. It'll give you a superior return. Look at the annualized CAGR. It goes up from 11.36 in the provided portfolio that you gave it from the previous screen to 15.43 with standard deviation. Again, both of them are actually below the 15%. What happened to diversification? Is VTI really the best option for Roth? You don't need international or small business? It got me thinking, and so I did one more thing while I was here. I did some back testing of asset allocations. I'm putting in the target allocation that I have. Again, it's the one I came up with based on the advice of experts, but one that is totally DIY. This is what I hope to aim for, and I'm going to compare it to what Schwab recommends and what Personal Capital recommends. And I'm not going to tell you which is which so you don't get offended, but these are the recommendations that came out from the two different places. I go for large cap with international, small cap, REIT, total bond, and cash. The other two portfolios like a lot less cash. In fact, I think one of them wants less than 1% cash. Totally uncomfortable for me. Of the three, CAGRs on my overall, again, these are all the buckets 1, 2, and 3. It suggests that the target asset allocation that I'm aiming for gets you a CAGR of 7.17% with a standard deviation of 9.62. And the alternatives have CAGRs that are lower and standard deviations that are riskier. Well, what if I'm wrong and I'll compare my asset allocation now with something that is weighted towards total stock fund, VTI, versus the alternatives. So let me go back to the portfolio visualizer and test something out. So I've added in my target allocations. Now I'm going to compare something where I lump all of the equity into the total US stock market. So I'm going to take these 10 here and I'm going to add it to this 54, and I'll keep everything else the same and analyze the two alternatives. Again, my current asset allocation with something that goes for just VTI total stock, CAGR improves and standard deviation goes down. I don't know what to make of this. It gives me some food for thought.
Now I should note, if you go back 2 videos, I had a big chunk of cash in my tax-deferred accounts that's still ready to be invested. But that's in bucket 1. And as I do that, I'll need to make sure I free up some in bucket 2 and bucket 3 to replenish and keep the time buckets in the balance that I need. So bucket 1 has 3 years of assets in it, and bucket 2 has 5 years of assets in it, and everything else is in bucket 3. It does take some work, but if anybody says bucket strategy is just too complex, tell them to see my playlist. I know how to manage it. It doesn't take rocket science, it just takes some common sense. I'll conclude with my standard warning. I am not a professional. So take these as entertaining ideas from one educated consumer to another. Always do your own due diligence and seek out a professional if you need one. Hey, and be sure to like and subscribe to this channel. The more likes and subscriptions, the higher this will be in the search results. We'll see you next time.